December 7, 1941, 7:55 in the morning. A sailor aboard the USS Nevada looks up and sees something impossible. Aircraft with red circles on their wings diving toward Battleship Row. For a split second, his brain refuses to accept what his eyes are seeing. Then the first bombs explode. In the next 110 minutes, 2,403 Americans will die. 18 ships will be sunk or damaged. 188 aircraft will be destroyed on the ground. And the United States will be forced into the most devastating war in human history. This is not the sanitized version you learned in history class. This is Pearl Harbor, minute by minute, bomb by bomb, decision by decision, the intelligence failures, the moments of extraordinary courage, and the single explosion that killed 1,177 men in 9 seconds. The attack that changed everything. Sunday, December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Oahu, territory of Hawaii. The morning began quietly. At 600 hours, reveille sounded aboard ships moored in Pearl Harbor. Sailors emerged from below decks for morning routines. On Battleship Row, 7 of the U.S. Pacific Fleet's 9 battleships rested at their moorings. The 8th, Pennsylvania, sat in dry dock undergoing maintenance. The 9th, Colorado, was on the west coast for overhaul. The ships along Battleship Row represented the core of American naval power in the Pacific. Nevada, Arizona, Tennessee, West Virginia, Maryland, Oklahoma, and California, each displacing over 30,000 tons, mounting 12 to 14-inch guns, and crewed by over 1,300 sailors. Together, they symbolized American might and American security. At Ford Island Naval Air Station in the center of the harbor, Navy patrol bombers and fighters sat parked wingtip to wingtip. At Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, and Bellows Field on Oahu, Army Air Forces bombers and pursuit aircraft were similarly grouped together. This tight parking was deliberate, a defense against sabotage, not air attack. The prevailing assessment was that Hawaii's greatest threat came from Japanese sympathizers among the local population, not from Japanese military forces thousands of miles away. The morning routine proceeded normally. Aboard ships, breakfast was served. Liberty parties prepared to go ashore. Musicians practiced for the daily 8 o'clock flag-raising ceremony. Chaplains prepared for church services scheduled for 0900 hours. Officers wrote letters or read newspapers. Enlisted men cleaned compartments, polished brass, and attended to the 1,000 tasks required to maintain a warship. At 0700 hours, the destroyer Ward, on patrol outside Pearl Harbor's entrance, detected and attacked a submarine attempting to enter the harbor. Ward depth-charged the submarine and reported sinking it. The report reached headquarters but generated no alarm. Submarine contacts were common, often false. The duty officer logged the report and continued routine operations. At 0702 hours, 2 Army privates manning a mobile radar station at Opana Point on Oahu's northern coast detected a large formation of aircraft approaching from the north, distance 132 miles. They reported the contact to the information center at Fort Shafter. The duty officer, Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, assumed the contact was a flight of B-17 bombers expected from California. He told the radar operators not to worry about it. Neither the submarine contact nor the radar detection triggered higher alert. December 7th was Sunday, a day of minimal activity and maximum liberty. Officers and men were relaxed, expecting a quiet day. They were wrong. To understand why Pearl Harbor happened, one must understand the deteriorating relationship between the United States and Japan in 1941. Japan, after a decade of military expansion in Asia, was locked in a brutal war with China that had begun in 1937. The conflict consumed vast resources and showed no sign of ending. Japan's military leadership sought to establish the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, an empire under Japanese control that would provide resources, particularly oil, rubber, and raw materials, essential for continued military operations. The problem was geography. The resources Japan needed were in Southeast Asia, the Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, French Indochina, and the American-controlled Philippines. Seizing these territories would bring Japan into conflict with Western colonial powers, particularly the United States. Throughout 1941, diplomatic relations between Washington and Tokyo deteriorated. The United States objected to Japanese aggression in China and Southeast Asia. In July 1941, when Japan occupied southern Indochina, President Franklin Roosevelt responded with an embargo. The United States froze Japanese assets and imposed a total embargo on oil exports to Japan. This embargo was devastating. Japan imported 80% of its oil from the United States. Without American oil, Japan's military forces would run out of fuel within months. Japanese leaders faced a choice: withdraw from China and accept American demands, or seize the resources they needed by force and accept war with the United States. The Japanese military chose war. Planning began for simultaneous operations, an attack on Pearl Harbor to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet, followed immediately by invasions of the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and other territories across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The Pearl Harbor attack was conceived by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet. Yamamoto understood that Japan could not win a prolonged war against American industrial capacity. However, he believed a devastating surprise attack might destroy American naval power in the Pacific, buying Japan time to consolidate conquests and establish defensive perimeters. Perhaps he hoped the shock would convince America to negotiate rather than fight. Planning for the attack, codenamed Operation Z, began in early 1941. The operation required extraordinary secrecy, complex logistics, and precise execution. A carrier strike force would cross the North Pacific undetected, launch aircraft against Pearl Harbor, and withdraw before American forces could respond. The strike force assembled at Tankan Bay in the Kuril Islands in late November. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded 6 aircraft carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shikaku, and Zuikaku. Together, they embarked 420 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and horizontal bombers. Supporting the carriers were 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 3 submarines. 8 oilers provided fuel for the long voyage. On November 26th, the strike force departed Tankan Bay and headed east across the North Pacific. The route chosen was deliberately through empty ocean where merchant shipping was minimal. The fleet maintained strict radio silence. Lookouts watched continuously for ships or aircraft that might spot them. Weather was poor, heavy seas and overcast skies, but this provided concealment. The voyage took 11 days. Fuel consumption was carefully monitored. Navigation was precise. The fleet remained undetected. On December 6th, the carriers reached their launching position 230 miles north of Rahu. Final preparations began. Aircraft were armed and fueled. Pilots attended final briefings. Mechanics conducted last checks. Everyone knew the attack would launch at dawn. Meanwhile, in Hawaii, American forces remained unaware. Intelligence had detected Japanese military preparations, but the consensus in Washington was that Japan would strike in Southeast Asia, not Hawaii. Warnings sent to Pearl Harbor emphasized sabotage threats, not air attack. Radar was operated on limited schedules. Reconnaissance flights were restricted to conserve fuel and aircraft. The Pacific Fleet remained on what was essentially peacetime alert. The stage was set for disaster. Several individuals would play critical roles in the events of December 7th, both Japanese and American. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led the Japanese air attack. Born in 1902, Fuchida had joined the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1921 and trained as a pilot. By 1941, he was one of Japan's most experienced aviators, having flown combat missions in China. Fuchida was selected to command the first attack wave personally, flying in the lead aircraft and coordinating the entire aerial assault. His skill and experience made him ideal for this role. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the carrier strike force. Nagumo was an experienced surface warfare officer but had limited aviation background. He was cautious by nature, concerned about preserving his carriers rather than taking excessive risks. This caution would later influence his decisions during and after the attack. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor Plan, commanded the combined fleet from Japan. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard and served as naval attaché in Washington. He understood American industrial capacity and believed Japan could not win a prolonged war. He had opposed war with the United States, but once the decision was made, committed fully to achieving maximum effect with the opening blow. On the American side, Admiral Husband Kimmel commanded the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Kimmel had been appointed in February 1941 and was considered an aggressive, capable officer. However, he would face criticism for the fleet's unpreparedness despite multiple intelligence warnings that war was imminent. Lieutenant General Walter Short commanded the U.S. Army forces in Hawaii, including all airfields and ground defenses. Short had interpreted warnings from Washington as emphasizing sabotage threats rather than external attack. He ordered aircraft parked close together for easier guarding, making them perfect targets for air attack. Among the thousands of Americans who would face the attack, several would display extraordinary courage. Mess Attendant Second Class Doris Miller, known as Dory, was a cook aboard the battleship West Virginia. African Americans in the 1941 Navy were restricted to mess duty and could not serve in combat roles. When West Virginia came under attack, Miller would act with courage that transcended the racial restrictions of his era. Ensign Joseph Taussig commanded a gun crew aboard the battleship Nevada. When the attack began, Taussig would remain at his post despite severe wounds, becoming one of the first officers wounded in the attack. Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd, commander of Battleship Division 1, was aboard his flagship Arizona. Kidd would be one of the highest-ranking American officers killed in the attack, dying when Arizona exploded. Captain Mervyn Bennion commanded the battleship West Virginia. Bennion would receive a mortal wound early in the attack, but would remain at his post, directing damage control until he died. These individuals, Japanese planners determined to deliver a devastating blow, American commanders unprepared for what was coming, and ordinary sailors who would display extraordinary valor, would all play roles in the drama about to unfold. December 7th, 0600 hours, 230 miles north of Oahu. Aboard the 6 Japanese carriers, organized chaos erupted as crews prepared for launch. Aircraft engines roared to life. Deck crews guided fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes to launch positions. The carriers turned into the wind and increased speed. The first wave consisted of 183 aircraft, 43 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, 49 Nakajima B-5N Kate high-level bombers carrying armor-piercing bombs converted from battleship shells, 40 B-5N torpedo bombers carrying specially modified torpedoes designed for shallow water use, and 51 HID-3A Val dive bombers. Commander Fuchida's aircraft, a Kate bomber, would lead the formation. Fuchida would observe the entire attack and send radio reports to Admiral Nagumo. The pilots had been training for months specifically for this mission. They knew their targets, they knew their attack routes, they knew the harbor layout better than many Americans stationed there. At 0600 hours, launch began. One by one, aircraft accelerated down carrier decks and lifted into the pre-dawn darkness. Within 15 minutes, all 183 aircraft were airborne. They formed up and turned south toward Oahu. The flight took approximately 90 minutes. Fuchida's formation flew at 3,000 meters altitude. Navigation was by compass and dead reckoning, with course corrections based on radio direction finding from Hawaiian commercial radio stations. As they approached Oahu, the weather cleared. Visibility improved. Fuchida could see the island ahead. At approximately 0740 hours, the formation crossed Oahu's northern coast near Kahuku Point. Below, the island appeared peaceful. No fighters rose to intercept. No anti-aircraft fire greeted them. The surprise was complete. Fuchida's aircraft approached from the north, flying over the central mountains toward Pearl Harbor on the southern coast. As they cleared the mountains, the harbor came into view. Fuchida could see Battleship Row, the naval air station, the repair facilities, everything exactly as intelligence photographs and models had depicted. At 0749 hours, Fuchida transmitted the code signal indicating surprise had been achieved. 222, the first syllable of Totsugeki, meaning charge. Moments later, he transmitted the success signal to Admiral Nagumo's flagship. Tora, 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 Tiger, 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 confirming complete surprise. The attack began. 0755 hours. The first bombs fell on Ford Island Naval Air Station. Dive bombers screamed down on parked aircraft. Explosions erupted across the airfield. Within seconds, dozens of planes were burning. Fighters strafed hangars and personnel. The surprise was total. Most Americans initially thought the explosions were an accident or a drill gone wrong. Simultaneously, torpedo bombers approached Battleship Row from the southeast, skimming low over the water. The torpedoes they carried had been specially modified with wooden fins to run in Pearl Harbor's shallow 40-foot depths. Standard aerial torpedoes would have buried themselves in the harbor mud. The modified weapons ran shallow, perfectly suited for attacking ships in the confined harbor. The battleship Oklahoma, moored outboard on the western side of Ford Island, was struck first. At 0756 hours, the first torpedo hit her port side. Within minutes, 4 more torpedoes slammed into her hull. The massive ship began listing to port immediately. Watertight doors were open for Sunday routine. Water flooded in catastrophically. Within 12 minutes, Oklahoma rolled over completely, capsizing with her bottom exposed and her masts touching the harbor mud. Over 400 men were trapped inside. Some survived in air pockets for days before rescue crews cut through the hull. West Virginia, moored inboard of Tennessee, took multiple torpedo hits. The first struck at 0757 hours. 5 more followed within minutes. The ship began listing severely to port. Quick thinking by the damage control officer, who ordered counter-flooding on the starboard side, kept the ship from capsizing like Oklahoma. But West Virginia settled onto the harbor bottom, burning and listing. 106 men died. Aboard West Virginia, Mess Attendant Doris Miller had been below decks collecting laundry when the attack began. Miller rushed topside. He found his battle station, an anti-aircraft magazine, destroyed. He helped move the mortally wounded Captain Bennion to shelter, then manned an unmanned 50 caliber machine gun. Miller had never been trained on the weapon. Gunnery training was forbidden for black sailors, but he aimed at attacking aircraft and fired until his ammunition was exhausted. His actions would later earn him the Navy Cross, making him the first African American to receive the decoration. California, moored at the southern end of Battleship Row, took 2 torpedo hits in the first minutes. Unlike most ships, California was undermanned that morning, with much of her crew on liberty. Damage control parties were insufficient. Water flooded through open hatches and unsealed doors. California began settling, eventually sinking in the shallow water with only her superstructure visible. Nevada, moored alone ahead of the others, took a single torpedo hit at 0800 hours. However, Nevada's watertight integrity was better maintained than other ships. She remained afloat and mobile. The crew would soon attempt to get underway, the only battleship to do so during the attack. Arizona, moored inboard alongside the repair ship Vestal, had so far avoided torpedo hits due to Vestal's position. But at 0806 hours, horizontal bombers attacked from high altitude. These Kate bombers carried 1,600-pound armor-piercing bombs converted from battleship shells. The bombs were designed to penetrate heavy armor. At approximately 0806 hours, a bomb struck Arizona near her number 2 turret, penetrating multiple decks and reaching the forward magazine where hundreds of tons of gunpowder were stored. The explosion was catastrophic. A massive fireball erupted, shooting flames and debris hundreds of feet into the air. The entire forward section of the ship disintegrated. The blast wave knocked men off nearby ships. The fireball was visible across the harbor. 1,177 men died in that single explosion, over half of Arizona's 1,333-man crew. Many died instantly, vaporized by the blast. Others were trapped below decks as the ship settled onto the harbor bottom. Fires burned for 2 days. Arizona would never be salvaged, remaining on the harbor bottom as a tomb for the men who died aboard her. The explosion of Arizona marked the attack's peak of destruction. In less than 15 minutes, 5 of the 7 battleships on Battleship Row had been sunk or severely damaged. Only Maryland and Tennessee, protected by ships moored outboard of them, remained relatively undamaged. But the attack continued. Dive bombers struck destroyers, cruisers, and auxiliaries throughout the harbor. The destroyer Shaw, in a floating dry dock, took 3 bomb hits. Her forward magazine exploded spectacularly, tearing off the entire bow section. The destroyer Cassin and the destroyer Downs, in dry dock alongside Pennsylvania, were bombed and burned, both declared total losses. At Hickam Field, Army Air Forces bombers sat parked wingtip to wingtip, perfect targets. Dive bombers and fighters attacked in coordinated waves. Within minutes, most of Hickam's bombers were burning wrecks. Barracks and hangars were bombed and strafed. Casualties among ground personnel were heavy. At Wheeler Field, Army pursuit aircraft suffered similar devastation. Japanese fighters destroyed most planes on the ground, then strafed buildings and personnel. The few American pilots who reached their aircraft found them riddled with bullets or already burning. At 08:25 hours, there was a brief lull. The first wave was expending its munitions and departing. Fuchita's formation regrouped over the harbor, circling to assess damage. Smoke from burning ships and airfields obscured much of the harbor. Fuchita could see that Battleship Row had been devastated. Most battleships were sinking, capsized, or burning. The air stations were wrecked. The surprise had been complete. Fuchita transmitted damage assessments to Admiral Nagumo. Then he turned north to return to the carriers. Behind him, a second wave was approaching. At 08:40 hours, 171 aircraft of the second wave arrived over Oahu. This wave consisted of 54 Kate horizontal bombers, 81 Val dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters. Unlike the first wave, which had achieved complete surprise, the second wave faced prepared defenses. American anti-aircraft guns were now manned and firing. Gunners, recovering from the initial shock, were putting up concentrated fire. The Japanese pilots found the sky filled with exploding shells and tracer rounds. The second wave's casualties would be significantly higher than the first. The second wave targeted ships that had survived the first attack, airfields, and base facilities. Nevada, the only battleship attempting to get underway, became the focus of intense attack. Nevada had taken a single torpedo hit early in the first wave, but had maintained power and steering. At approximately 08:40 hours, Lieutenant Commander Francis Thomas, Nevada's senior officer aboard, the captain was ashore, made the decision to sortie from the harbor. Getting underway while under attack was extraordinarily dangerous, but remaining stationary made Nevada an easy target. If Nevada could reach open water, she might survive. Nevada backed away from her mooring and began moving down the channel toward the harbor entrance. As she moved, she became the most prominent target in the harbor. Every Japanese pilot in the second wave seemed to attack Nevada. Dive bombers screamed down one after another. Bombs struck the forecastle, the bridge, the superstructure. Fires broke out across the ship. Casualties mounted rapidly. The Navy command post at the harbor entrance realized that if Nevada sank in the narrow channel, she would block the entire harbor. Ships inside would be trapped. Ships outside could not enter. The harbor would be unusable. Signalmen ordered Nevada to beach herself rather than continue toward the entrance. At approximately 09:10 hours, Nevada deliberately ran aground near Hospital Point, preventing her from blocking the channel. She settled into the mud, burning and heavily damaged, but not lost. Elsewhere in the harbor, the second wave attacked with methodical efficiency. The cruiser Helena, moored where a battleship had been earlier, took a torpedo hit and severe damage. The old battleship Utah, relegated to training duty and moored at Ford Island, capsized after multiple torpedo hits. The repair ship Vestal, alongside the sunken Arizona, was bombed and nearly sunk, but was beached to prevent complete loss. At the airfields, the second wave continued destruction that the first wave had begun. Any aircraft that had survived the first attack were finished off. Hangars were bombed, fuel tanks were strafed, buildings burned throughout the bases. American fighter pilots who managed to get airborne fought desperately against overwhelming odds. Second Lieutenant George Welch and Second Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor, both based at Halliwell Field, managed to take off in P-40 fighters during the lull between waves. They shot down several Japanese aircraft before running out of ammunition, landed to rearm, took off again, and shot down more. Welch was credited with 4 kills, Taylor with 2. Both would receive Distinguished Service Crosses, but such successes were rare. Most American aircraft never got airborne, most pilots never reached their planes. The Japanese controlled the sky completely. At 09:45 hours, the second wave withdrew. The last Japanese aircraft departed, turning north toward the carriers. Behind them, Pearl Harbor burned. Massive columns of black smoke rose thousands of feet into the air, visible from miles away. The harbor was littered with sunken, capsized, and burning ships. The airfields were graveyards of destroyed aircraft. Bodies floated in the oil-covered water. The wounded filled every available medical facility. The attack had lasted 110 minutes. 2 waves totaling 354 aircraft had struck with devastating effect. Japanese losses were minimal: 29 aircraft shot down, 1 submarine sunk, 5 midget submarines lost. Japanese casualties were 64 men killed. American losses were catastrophic. 18 ships had been sunk or damaged, including all 8 battleships present. 188 aircraft had been destroyed. 2,403 Americans were dead. 1,178 were wounded. The United States Pacific Fleet, America's primary instrument of power in the Pacific, had been crippled in a single morning. As the last Japanese aircraft disappeared over the horizon, Pearl Harbor descended into organized chaos. The immediate priorities were rescue, damage control, and defense against possible follow-up attacks. Rescue efforts began even before the attack ended. Sailors in the water, many covered in oil, swam toward shore or to nearby ships. Boats moved through the harbor picking up survivors. The capsized Oklahoma presented a unique challenge. Hundreds of men were trapped inside air pockets. Rescuers could hear them pounding on the hull from inside. Cutting crews worked frantically with acetylene torches, cutting holes through the thick steel to reach trapped sailors. Some were saved, many were not. The last survivor was rescued 32 hours after the ship capsized. But by then, most of those trapped had drowned as air pockets slowly flooded. Damage control parties fought fires across the harbor. Arizona burned for 2 days, her fires impossible to extinguish with conventional means. West Virginia's fires were eventually controlled, allowing her to be raised and rebuilt. Nevada, aground near Hospital Point, was saved by prompt flooding to prevent capsizing. California settled onto the harbor bottom, but was later raised and returned to service. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. The Naval Hospital, designed for approximately 200 patients, received over 900 casualties in the first hours. Army hospitals at Schofield Barracks and Tripler took hundreds more. Civilian hospitals throughout Honolulu assisted. Medical personnel worked without rest, performing triage, treating wounds, and dealing with burns, shrapnel injuries, and blast trauma. Identification of the dead began immediately and would continue for weeks. Many bodies were burned beyond recognition. Some were never found, lost when ships sank or blown apart in explosions. The morgue at the Naval Hospital overflowed. Temporary facilities were established. The grim work of identifying, documenting, and preparing bodies for burial continued. Defense against possible follow-up attacks consumed enormous effort. No one knew if the Japanese would return. Anti-aircraft guns remained manned. Fighters that survived the attack were armed and prepared for immediate launch. Radar stations watched continuously. Reconnaissance flights searched for the Japanese carriers. False alarms triggered alerts throughout the day and night. The search for the Japanese fleet was futile. Admiral Nagumo's carriers had already turned north and were steaming away at high speed. American reconnaissance aircraft searched in the wrong directions. The Japanese were never located. They would return safely to Japan, having achieved everything they had hoped. On Oahu, martial law was declared. The entire island went on war footing. Blackouts were enforced. Civilians were restricted. Japanese residents, including many American citizens of Japanese ancestry, faced immediate suspicion and restrictions that would later escalate to internment. Communication with Washington was difficult. Telephone lines were limited. Radio traffic was heavy. Initial reports were fragmentary and often inaccurate. President Roosevelt learned of the attack at approximately 1:40 p.m. Washington time, 7:40 a.m. in Hawaii. The news shocked the nation. Roosevelt immediately convened his cabinet and military advisors. At Pearl Harbor, the scale of the disaster became clearer as the day progressed. 8 battleships sunk or severely damaged, 200 aircraft destroyed, over 2,000 dead. The Pacific Fleet had been dealt a devastating blow. How devastating would not be fully understood for days as assessments continued. Admiral Kimmel and General Short both faced immediate criticism. How had this happened? Why was there no warning? Why were defenses unprepared? The questions would continue for months and years, leading to multiple investigations, boards of inquiry, and eventually congressional hearings. Both officers would be relieved of command within days. Their careers ended. Whether they bore primary responsibility or were scapegoats for broader failures would be debated for decades. The success of the Pearl Harbor attack resulted from multiple factors: Japanese excellence in planning and execution, American complacency and intelligence failures, and simple bad luck. Japanese planning was meticulous. Admiral Yamamoto conceived an operation requiring extraordinary coordination, secrecy, and precision. The carrier strike force crossed the North Pacific undetected. Pilots trained for months on specific targets. Aircraft were modified for Pearl Harbor's unique conditions. Torpedoes were fitted with wooden fins for shallow water. Armor-piercing bombs were created from battleship shells. Every aspect was considered and addressed. Japanese execution was excellent. The carriers launched their aircraft precisely on schedule. Pilots navigated accurately across 230 miles of ocean. They achieved complete tactical surprise. Coordination between different attack elements was effective. Losses were minimal. The entire operation demonstrated professionalism and skill. American intelligence had detected numerous indicators of Japanese preparations. The U.S. had broken Japanese diplomatic codes and knew war was imminent. However, intelligence analysts assumed Japan would strike in Southeast Asia, the Philippines, Malaya, or the Dutch East Indies. Few seriously considered Hawaii as a target. The islands were too far from Japan. The attack seemed too risky. This assumption proved disastrously wrong. Specific warnings failed to trigger appropriate responses. When the destroyer Ward reported sinking a submarine near the harbor entrance at dawn on December 7th, the report was noted but generated no alarm. When Army radar detected a large aircraft formation approaching from the north at 0702 hours, the duty officer assumed it was expected B-17 bombers from California. Both warnings were essentially ignored. Defensive preparations at Pearl Harbor emphasized sabotage threats rather than external attack. General Short's orders resulted in aircraft being grouped together for easier guarding, making them perfect targets for air attack. Anti-aircraft ammunition was locked away, requiring time to distribute when the attack began. Radar operated on limited schedules. Reconnaissance flights were curtailed. The defenses were configured for the wrong threat. Operational decisions created vulnerability. Concentrating the fleet at Pearl Harbor on weekends made sense for logistics and personnel management, but created a target-rich environment. Having so many ships in one place, all in restricted waters, meant that an attacker achieving surprise could inflict maximum damage quickly. Luck played a role. The Japanese carriers crossed the North Pacific during a period of poor weather that concealed them from detection. They approached Hawaii from the north, where shipping was minimal. They achieved surprise despite multiple indicators that should have alerted defenders. The timing, early Sunday morning when many personnel were on liberty or sleeping, maximized confusion. Ironically, some American good fortune hid within the disaster. The three Pacific Fleet carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were not at Pearl Harbor during the attack. Enterprise and Lexington were at sea delivering aircraft to Midway and Wake Islands. Saratoga was on the west coast. These carriers survived and would form the nucleus of American striking power in the months ahead. Additionally, the Japanese attack focused on battleships, which were already becoming obsolete. The future of naval warfare lay with carriers and aviation. The battleships lost at Pearl Harbor would mostly be raised and returned to service, but their strategic importance was diminishing. The carrier's survival would prove far more significant than the battleship's temporary loss. Finally, the Japanese made critical errors. They failed to attack Pearl Harbor's oil storage tanks, which held millions of gallons of fuel essential for fleet operations. They failed to destroy the submarine base, which would become crucial for offensive operations. They failed to attack the repair facilities, which would enable salvage of damaged ships. Had these targets been destroyed, American recovery would have taken far longer. The attack succeeded tactically but failed strategically. Japan achieved surprise and inflicted severe damage. But the United States was not knocked out of the war. American industrial capacity, untouched by the attack, would soon produce ships, aircraft, and weapons in quantities Japan could never match. And the attack unified American public opinion in a way nothing else could have. Before Pearl Harbor, America was divided on entering the war. After Pearl Harbor, the nation united for total victory. December 8, 1941, 12:30 p.m., Washington, D.C. President Franklin Roosevelt appeared before a joint session of Congress. His speech, written the previous night with input from close advisors, would become one of the most famous in American history. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Roosevelt detailed the attacks on Pearl Harbor, Guam, the Philippines, Wake Island, and Midway. He noted that Japan had been conducting diplomatic negotiations in Washington even as its forces were preparing to attack. He concluded by requesting that Congress declare that a state of war existed between the United States and Japan. The speech lasted 6 minutes. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 1 hour, Congress voted to declare war. The Senate voted 82-0. The House voted 388-1. The sole dissenting vote came from Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, a pacifist who had also voted against entering World War I. The declaration of war against Japan was signed by President Roosevelt at 4:10 p.m. The United States was at war. 3 days later, on December 11th, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, honoring their alliance with Japan. The United States immediately declared war on Germany and Italy in return. America was now fully engaged in World War II, fighting on two fronts against enemies on opposite sides of the globe. The mobilization that followed was unprecedented. Within months, millions of Americans would be in uniform, factories would convert to war production, women would enter the workforce in massive numbers, rationing would be implemented, civil liberties would be restricted, Japanese Americans would be interned. The entire economy and society would be reorganized for total war. The Pearl Harbor attack transformed America. The nation that had been reluctant to enter the war, divided between interventionists and isolationists, uncertain about foreign commitments, became unified in purpose overnight. The attack answered every argument against war. Americans who had opposed involvement now supported it. The debate was over. There would be no negotiated peace, no compromise, no settlement. Only complete victory would suffice. The consequences of Pearl Harbor extended far beyond the immediate destruction. For Japan, the attack was a tactical success, but a strategic disaster. Japanese planners had hoped to cripple American naval power and force negotiations. Instead, they unified American opinion and ensured a fight to the finish. Admiral Yamamoto, who understood America's industrial capacity, reportedly said he feared they had awakened a sleeping giant. Whether he actually said these words is debated, but the sentiment was accurate. For the United States, Pearl Harbor became a rallying cry. Remember Pearl Harbor appeared on recruiting posters, war bonds, and propaganda. The attack justified any sacrifice, any effort, any cost to achieve victory. The nation mobilized with an intensity that would have been impossible without Pearl Harbor's unifying effect. Strategically, the attack accelerated America's shift from a battleship-centric navy to a carrier-centric one. The battleships damaged or sunk at Pearl Harbor would mostly be salvaged and returned to service, but they played secondary roles in the Pacific War. Carriers became the primary striking force. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 would be the first naval engagement where opposing ships never saw each other, fought entirely by aircraft. The Battle of Midway in June 1942, where 4 Japanese carriers were sunk in one day, would demonstrate carrier dominance decisively. Technologically, Pearl Harbor drove innovation. Radar development accelerated. Code breaking received increased resources and attention. Aircraft design improved rapidly. Damage control techniques evolved. The lessons learned in blood at Pearl Harbor influenced every subsequent naval operation. Politically, Pearl Harbor's impact lasted decades. The Day of Infamy remained in American consciousness. Veterans of Pearl Harbor were honored. The Arizona Memorial, built over the sunken battleship, became a site of pilgrimage. December 7th was commemorated annually. The attack became the defining moment that brought America into World War II and shaped the nation's role as a global superpower. For individuals, Pearl Harbor was transformative. The 2,403 Americans who died became symbols of sacrifice. The survivors carried memories of that morning for their entire lives. Many never spoke of what they had seen. Others dedicated themselves to ensuring it would never happen again. Doris Miller, the mess attendant who manned a gun despite having no training, became a symbol of courage transcending racial barriers. He would die in combat in 1943 when his ship was torpedoed. His story would inspire generations. The investigations and recriminations continued for years. Admiral Kimmel and General Short were blamed for unpreparedness, though many historians argue they were scapegoats for broader failures. Multiple investigations reached different conclusions. Conspiracy theories alleging Roosevelt knew of the attack in advance persist despite lack of credible evidence. The truth is more mundane. Intelligence was misinterpreted, warnings were ignored, and assumptions proved wrong. Pearl Harbor's lessons remained relevant long after 1941. The danger of surprise attack, the importance of intelligence, the need for vigilance, the consequences of complacency. Military professionals study Pearl Harbor not as ancient history, but as a case study in what can go wrong when preparation fails and assumptions replace analysis. December 7, 1941, began as an ordinary Sunday morning in Hawaii. It ended with America at war, 2,403 people dead, and the course of world history altered. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not inevitable. Different decisions, better intelligence interpretation, proper defensive preparations, or simple luck might have prevented it or reduced its impact. But history deals with what happened, not what might have been. What happened was that Japan achieved tactical surprise and inflicted severe damage on the US Pacific Fleet. But in doing so, Japan guaranteed its own eventual defeat. The attack unified America, ensured total commitment to victory, and awakened the industrial giant that would produce the weapons, ships, and aircraft to win the war. The men who died at Pearl Harbor did not die in vain. Their sacrifice galvanized a nation. Their memory inspired millions. The ships they served on, even those that sank, contributed to eventual victory. Arizona remains on the harbor bottom, a memorial to those who died. But other ships damaged that day: California, West Virginia, Tennessee, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Nevada, were raised, repaired, and returned to service. They fought across the Pacific, participated in major battles, and survived to see victory. Pearl Harbor changed America from a reluctant participant to a fully engaged belligerent. The nation that entered World War II on December 8, 1941, was different from the nation that had debated intervention on December 6. The transformation was instant and complete. The attack that was meant to intimidate instead enraged. The blow that was meant to cripple instead strengthened. The surprise that was meant to force negotiations instead guaranteed unconditional surrender as the only acceptable outcome. December 7, 1941. A date which will live in infamy. The day everything changed. The attack on Pearl Harbor remains not just a military event, but a defining moment in American history. The day America was forced into World War II and began its journey to becoming a global superpower. The sleeping giant had been awakened, and it was furious.